David Gazzard, DPG Advisory Director, former Liberal advisor, and Ben Oquist, Executive Director at the Australia Institute, former advisor with the Greens. This lockdown continues. Such a different handling of the numbers when you compare it to, say, New South Wales, Ben.
I think Victoria is a different situation. Some people have said it's because people travel more across Victoria than they do in New South Wales and Sydney, where people tend to stick in their communities. There's obviously something different about Victoria. It does strike me as a little odd that they haven't had the QR system going properly. We're all totally used to a smooth running app that's kind of statewide. But obviously, there's now fault at the federal level as well. I think the fact that it broke out in South Australia, out of South Australian quarantine and went to Victoria, kind of shows the national implications. And I suppose that's the big thing that's shifted in the debate this time, is there's more blame being laid on the feds than there was last time because of the failure of quarantine and the failure of the vaccine rollout. Not to say there's not fault on both sides, but clearly the dynamic has changed and the federal government is under a lot more pressure this time than with the previous lockdowns in Victoria because of the debate about vaccine rollout and quarantine. And as Paul Kelly said today, the failure of the government not to even know how many health workers in aged care sectors had the vaccine was kind of devastating, a devastating failure of administration, and that they previously had the ban on health workers working in multiple aged care sites. They withdrew that ban, and now they've put it back in. Kind of shows that it's not working. And I do think whoever you're blaming, the dynamic has changed, and the Commonwealth's facing more blame, and it's changing the political dynamic again, isn't it? It wasn't long ago that we were talking about an early election off the back of a good budget. Now no one's talking about that, and that underscores that pandemic politics. It changes fast.
Do you accept that the balance has shifted and the government's under more pressure on this?
Early elections and all that's nonsense. What we're seeing here are different jurisdictions and their capacity to deal with the virus, in the knowledge that it was always going to get out through quarantine or there was going to be contact somewhere. And the one thing you would look at if you were in Victoria is the fact that New South Wales has its borders open still. And the Premier, Gladys Berejiklian, says, we have the confidence in our health system to be able to manage this, and we're always going to have to manage it. It's like any flu or any other virus that gets out. You want to have the confidence in your health system to be able to manage that. It was the objective of National Cabinet over a year ago to get to this position. It has been, if anything, a failure of various state bureaucracies to not put in place the contact tracing and testing regimes that they were supposed to. And you're starting to see the gulf between those who can manage and those who can't, opening wider and wider. Everyone has accepted that quarantine is never going to be perfect. It's 99% perfect, as Pete pointed out. And as the PM said the other day, if we'd aimed to get a 99% success rate in quarantine, we would have jumped at that a year ago. You've got to have the system in place behind it that can cope with the occasional outbreak. And you can't go to statewide lockdowns every time there is an outbreak. And we're seeing the gap opening up between the states who can manage it and those who can't.
Has beyond that administration problem that you allude to there in terms of its comparison, say, Victoria to New South Wales, Josh Frydenberg made the same comparison, albeit being cautious not to slam the Victorian authorities who he has to work with, but he did make that comparison on this program a bit earlier, saying that New South Wales hasn't been in a statewide lockdown, yet Victoria's had now its fourth. But beyond that, do you think enough of the balance, when you look at the mental health implications in all of this, the economic and the mental health component, is that taking too much of the burden compared to COVID still?
Look, I think there's flow-on effects that cascade down from any failure in this, and Victoria has unfortunately borne the brunt of it. You'd have mental health flow-on effects. You've got economic effects. You've got business effects. You've got family effects. You've got people who can't, see others who've died for funerals. You've got all kinds of things that cascade from this. But the central point is you've got to have a system that can manage to contain outbreaks where possible, knowing that they're probably going to occur.
Gladys Berejiklian made a valid point recently where she said we have to have a discussion about how this is viewed, this virus. Obviously, get the place vaccinated first, at least enough to prevent, to provide that herd immunity. But then we've got to say we can't have zero. It can't be zero because otherwise we have this distortion in our economy, in our societies permanently.
Yep, that's great. Absolutely, we need that discussion. But it's the first part of the premise of your question that is the urgent thing now. It's the vaccine rollout, and it's not going well.
It's improving though, isn't it? I mean, the numbers have been growing very significantly recently. It's up over 4.5 million.
Yeah,
it's not great, but it is growing.
As Paul Kelly pointed out, 50% of over 70s approximately haven't had their first dose. That's over 70-year-olds, let alone everybody else. It's not going well enough. Everybody knows it's not going well enough. The fact that healthcare workers in aged care, we don't even know how many have had it, kind of proves the point. And we need to get that vaccine sorted. And now, I don't really mind the fact that the Prime Minister refuses to call it a race and says it's not a race. That's just wording. But it does underscore there hasn't been the sense of urgency.
Will there be urgency in terms of the financial support? Will the federal government, do you think, end up saying, look, it's gone into the second week, we're going to have to stump up here?
I think the federal government is under pressure to give some. I think the debate, as I was saying earlier, has changed and there's more responsibility being placed on the Commonwealth for the failures of vaccination rollout and quarantine. 99% is good, but it's not as good as 100%, and there's all sorts of problems with hotel quarantine that feds haven't built a national system. And because they're under pressure on that, and because the attacks on the states that the Commonwealth was running last year aren't working politically anymore, I do think they're under political pressure to come up with solutions. And one easy way of showing that you're doing something is offering some financial support.
The Treasurer says he's talking to his counterpart. The Prime Minister said he'll talk to the acting Premier. Are they open to more dollars?
I mean, I think they're going to have to be, but bear in mind that the Commonwealth, through the last year, has spent 16% of GDP on keeping the economy afloat, which is a huge amount of money. It's the biggest spending program ever. The states have put in roughly 2% of GSP. So there's been a vast amount of expenditure coming from the Commonwealth, not so much from the states. Now, I'm not saying that in blaming, and I don't accept through, after we've had National Cabinet that's gone for a year, that this blame game that Ben keeps talking about is evident. The rollout of the vaccine has intensified because the PM put National Cabinet on a war footing about 6 weeks ago, and vaccination rates have doubled in that time. Aged care, now all of aged care residents, 97% across Australia have been offered the first jab, I think 100% in Victoria.
And the spend has worked in terms of
the spend has
look
worked.
At the GDP figure.
Now, Ben has never seen a problem he doesn't want to throw money at, but at some point, when you look in the out years and the debts that have accrued, you can't just keep spending money. And we're now into the fourth lockdown. This is exactly why we've been talking about this for weeks now, and Ben's criticised the closure of the borders, but it was to prevent what has just happened. So national economic harm on the back of a state border lockdown, a state lockdown. So this was why we wanted to make sure the system was as resilient as it possibly could be before allowing international arrivals, particularly from some of those hotspots.
Let's look at the speech from Anthony Albanese talking about China. He says, basically, he and Penny Wong saying that on the substance, when it comes to foreign interference, on Huawei and the 5G network, on all the major issues, they are at one with the government. They say the government's been politicising the rhetoric. Is that a fair enough critique?
Yes, I think it is. We discussed this previously when Penny Wong made the first speech in this area a couple of weeks ago, and I said I thought it was significant, while the opposition is arguing that there is bipartisanship still in the overall approach. It's fair to say that this is a break in pure bipartisanship, and they are criticising some of the rhetoric and the approach. And overall, I think the thing that sticks for them is the lack of a strategy and overall plan. And that's a feeling that a feeling that's coming out in the community a lot, not just on this, but on other issues. And I think you're going to hear a lot more from the opposition about the lack of a plan, the lack of a strategy going forward for the Morrison government on this issue, but others too. I do think it's fair enough to criticise some of the loose rhetoric that we've seen both from Dutton and Pizzullo. It's not helping that beating the drums of war rhetoric, and I think it was a measured and sensible speech from our. I know David thinks the Prime Minister can do no wrong on any issue any time, and I've been guilty of giving him too much praise when he probably didn't deserve that much praise. But I do think there's room for improvement in the government's handling of China and the long-term strategy.
Just 30 seconds, your response.
Well, let's set aside the rhetoric and let's look at where the facts are on this. So over the weekend, we've seen New Zealand come aboard with all of the points that Australia has made vis-a-vis China. We've seen...
Federal Labor is too.
Yeah, absolutely, and I welcome those comments. We've also seen, for the first time ever, an OECD Secretary-General come from Australia, which demonstrates that in terms of where we're positioned in the world, other liberal democracies are looking to get in behind and back Australia's appointment, particularly across the Asia-Pacific. And one of the reasons for that is Australia's had a leadership position on China.
David Gazzard, Ben Oquist, gents, thank you very much for that.
20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.